But Josh, we're so glad to have you here tonight. The Witches of Willow Cove is a book that has been widely popular since it came out in May. It has 2-starred reviews from big industry reviewers, which is huge. And Spooky Kidlit called it a fun, thrilling read that will leave you wanting to spend a lot more time in the magical world of Willow Cove. So if you love witches, which who does not, and magical teens, then this is such a fun book. So Josh, we're thrilled to have you here tonight. We'd love to start with you telling us a bit about yourself and where you are right now and what's going on with your life.
Well, thanks for having me. Let's see. So I am the author of The Witches of Willow Cove and also a travel writer and travel editor. I have a family travel website called Family Vacationist, and in my spare time, I like to go hiking and hang out with my 2 kids who are 11 and 13, and then my wife.
Awesome. And you're in
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm in just north of Boston. So actually my town neighbors Salem, Massachusetts.
Okay, which I think is super interesting and relevant to this conversation. Because I'd love to get in a minute a little bit into your background and where you grew up, because I think that your whole history is fascinating and makes you the perfect person to author this book. But I did forget to mention Carrie's in the comments. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to type them in, and we're over in Zoom, but she'll feed them to us, and we're happy to field your questions as we go. So no need to wait till the end, and Josh is happy to talk about almost anything that you would like to ask. So feel free to jump in there. So you've talked a little bit about where you are, and this is a question you probably get a lot, but I'd love to know where the idea for the Witches of Willow Cove came from, what your inspirations were, and kind of knowing a little bit about your background. This is a leading question, but what kind of led you to this type of book?
Well, it's an interesting story because this is not the novel that I set out to write at first. I had written what I thought was going to be like the next great epic fantasy, like a George R.R. Martin Game of Thrones kind of thing. And, I was very proud of it, and I handed it to my wife to read. She read it, she was my first beta reader, and I was like, what did you think? And she's like, well, and I was like, oh, that can't be good. She's like, well, it's not really your personality. She's like, you're kind of funny, and you kind of like superheroes and stuff, and maybe you should try writing something that's more like you. And I was like, you're wrong. No, absolutely not. But just to show you that you're wrong, I'm going to just see what that looks like. And like within about a paragraph, I was like, oh, darn it, she was right. This is what I should be writing. This is so I had set out to write something that was sort of like just like a teenage adventure, maybe with a little bit of magic or something. And so naturally, because that was what just came to me before I even had the idea. I just had this vision of 2 kids, and they were immediately in my head before I even wrote anything. It was Abby and Robbie. And I was like, I guess I'm going to write this. And so then I started to figure out, well, what's this story going to be about? Well, I'm going to set it near where I live because I know this area. I can write about it pretty authentically. And then after I wrote a rough draft of the first chapter, and I decided this was actually something that maybe I should be writing something like this. I took a step back and started to think about what was the actual story I wanted to get to, what was the setting that I wanted to do. And so then there were really just some questions that I started asking myself. And it stemmed from a fact that I learned when I was younger, which is that the Salem witch trials did not occur in modern day Salem. They occurred another town over from Salem, which at the time was Salem Village, but no longer is. And it seemed like such a cool idea to me that there's this whole secret history that people living in that town might not even know that the Salem witch trials happened there. And then I started to think, well, what if I were a kid growing up in a town like that had a secret history? And then what if I discovered that I had a connection to that secret history? What would that look like? And I started to ask those kinds of questions. And it led me to some interesting answers that eventually became the foundation of the story for The Witches of Willow Cove.
I love that. That's a great story. And a lot of interesting history about Salem, which is hugely popular. Interesting.
Yeah, I grew up in a town called Rowley, which is maybe like 10 miles from Salem. But what was interesting is even in our little town, we had a little monument because there were people that were accused of witchcraft all over New England, and including in my town. And so I remember that from a young age, like seeing this little monument just on my walk to school, and kind of, I guess, stowing that information away. But you know, New England is such a perfect setting, especially this time of year, October, November. It gets dark early. The weather is perfect and crisp and just sort of naturally spooky. And so it all kind of fed into the atmosphere that I wanted to create for the story.
I love that. That's perfect. And you've kind of covered this, so we can skip it if you've already addressed it. But are there specific experiences that influenced you in the writing?
Well, I think like my entire childhood was sort of like, I haven't mentioned this. I grew up living in a working Victorian funeral home. So I always had this sort of spooky element just kind of in the background. And like I based a lot of the relationships in the story and a lot of the events, you know, the sneaking around in caves and stuff, like that was all from my childhood in a lot of ways. There's a scene in the Witches of Willow Cove where some of the characters are trying to break into the police station to get something. And I didn't do exactly that, but I did something very similar. A friend of mine had basically discovered a back way into the town hall. And we basically kind of like traced some trails that were part of the old like underground railroad network, like in our town, and probably was very dangerous. And we didn't actually get into anywhere, but it was cool, like going through and doing this stuff. And when I was writing the book, I was just calling up a lot of these memories from things that we did as kids and just sort of expanding on them to make them a little more fantastic and exciting.
I love that. It's a version of write what you know, but you took it to a whole new level. So, really fascinating. Darby asks, what was your favorite scene to write?
Oh my God. You know, I think my favorites are the ones that surprise me. And there's a moment about 2/3 of the way through the book when Abby is, she's finally like, she's gone investigating Miss Winters, and she encounters her in the tunnels underneath the house. And Abby, you know, sort of thinks like, I've got you now. I know the truth. You tell me what's going on. And then Miss Winters says, well, maybe you don't know the whole story. You don't know everything about, you know, this other character. And it was that sort of like moment when I realized, as I was writing in my first draft, that Miss Winters had an entire story that I wanted to explore as well. And I didn't want her to just be this sort of cardboard cutout villain. So writing that scene was kind of the moment for me when Abby realizes that Miss Winters she says something to the effect of like, no one is just one thing. And she's not just this woman that's teaching them. She's also had this other life. She likes punk rock. Like, she's this interesting person with a lot of different layers. And realizing that about her kind of helped open up like, what is the actual theme of this book? And that was one of the ones that I wanted to explore. So because it was so exciting for me to discover that, it became an exciting scene to write.
Yeah. Excellent. Great answer. Was there anything that turned out differently than you anticipated? She kind of grew and evolved. Was there anything that totally caught you off guard?
I don't know if any one specific thing, other than I had an outline, and I basically abandoned my outline after the first chapter. So my outline did not end with Abby and Robbie like flying on a broomstick at the end of the first chapter. It was just sort of like the first in a series of me asking like, what's the most exciting thing that could happen in this scene? And then that happened, and I was like, well, there goes the rest of my outline. I guess I'll just adjust it from there. Maybe the most surprising thing was making Robbie a viewpoint character, because that happened entirely by accident too. I wrote the first chapter from Abby's perspective, and then I wrote the second chapter, which sort of continued the scene. And then the third chapter came around, and I just started writing from Robbie's perspective, and I was like, oh, I didn't know I was going to be doing that. And now I guess I have to have an entire story arc for him too. And that took me by surprise, and it kind of like it actually made the book much more difficult to write because it felt like I was writing 2 entire books. But although I don't recommend introducing viewpoint characters accidentally, I'm glad that I did, because I think it added a whole other layer to the story that wasn't there in the original draft.
Agreed. I can't imagine the book without Robbie at this point. With that said, was there a character you related to the most?
It's interesting. They're all facets of my personality, both the good and the bad. There are moments that each of them have, where I'm like, this is a lot of me on the page. Whether it's Abby or Zeus or Robbie or Amethyst or any of them, are all pieces of me. And so I think that some are easier for me to write and get into their heads a little, but they all feel like they're a part of me speaking through them in some way.
I love that. Do you have a favorite? Is that evil to ask?
I think, my favorite character to write, like from the viewpoint, is Abby. I find it very easy to kind of get inside her head and figure out. But I also love like certain character combinations. I love Abby and Amethyst together are just a lot of fun to write. Robbie and Becca are a lot of fun to write. And then when I have like all 6 of the witches together, and they're just sort of bickering and yelling at each other and sort of being daffy, but also like clearly caring for each other, I find those scenes incredibly fun to write. And I've done a lot of them in the sequel because the dynamics are a little bit different, because we're not building the team. They already sort of have formed. And so it's just, whenever I'm stuck, it's very easy to just be like, well, I know what this character would say, and then I know how that character would respond to it, and then I'll probably end up cutting a lot of it at some point, because it's but it's very easy to just imagine conversations and then build scenes around that for me.
I love that. I thought it was interesting today. We had our little book club discussion. We asked who favorite characters were, and I thought it was really interesting that most of them were character pairs. Like, they liked how they played off of each other and how their interactions were. And so for me personally, I think nailing an ensemble cast is one of the most brilliant parts of writing. And so I think that's one thing that's so fun about your book, and that came out really well in people's responses. Like, I love so-and-so because they did this with so-and-so, and I love the energy between these two. So I think that's a really fun dynamic that you've created, and that they speak to you in your head and you know how they'll respond is a testament to how well developed they are.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of times that's how if I'm stuck in a scene, I'm just like, well, let's just start mid-conversation and then kind of write that out, and then we'll work backwards from how they got into that conversation.
I love that.
I have like pages and pages of notebooks where it's just like dialogue back and forth, and I don't even need to write who is speaking it, because I know just from the how the conversation begins, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, this was these 2 characters. And I enjoy throwing in characters that are very different or don't get along, but sort of don't get along in a slightly affectionate way. That's a dynamic that I enjoy writing a lot.
I love that. You did a really good job of it. You mentioned that it was easiest to get in Abby's head. Candace asks, did you have a favorite character to write? Was one more fun than the others to explore?
I think Amethyst is the most fun to write because she has like absolutely no filter. And she will just say whatever she's thinking, whatever's on her mind, even if it's the like least appropriate possible response. But I think one of the things that I love about her is I think that that's kind of a defense mechanism, and she's sort of like this soft marshmallow on the inside, and she doesn't want anyone to know that. So she's built this sort of outer personality, but I enjoyed the interplay between her and Abby, and how like Abby kind of chips away at that over the course of the story, until at one point Amethyst is the one saying that you're my best friend. And I think the dynamic between those 2 characters surprised me over the course of the story too, because it originally was going to be going in a very different direction, but now I can't imagine them as anything other than sort of how they turned out.
I love that. Great answer. Carrie said, I know you have a 13-year-old son with and that age plays a big role in this book. Why did you choose to do female witches instead of male warlocks?
Well, I don't know exactly why, other than I think you typically, I guess the character of Abby sort of came to me first, and I really liked that. And then the rest of the story kind of came from that. At one point, I had toyed around with doing sort of like warlocks and wizards and that kind of thing, but I did feel like the boy wizard territory was already sort of well established in middle grade fiction, and I don't know. For some reason, I feel more comfortable writing from the perspective of the witches and everything. I think it's interesting because at that age, you're still figuring out a lot of things, but you just see like teenage girls don't get a ton of respect, and I think they don't get a ton of like, they're not treated particularly well and they're not valued particularly well. And I think like writing from that perspective, it's just a really interesting perspective to try to adopt and to empower that a little bit.
I love that. That's excellent. Kind of going along with that, you have a lot of themes of friendships and interactions with adults, and without being overly didactic or preachy or heavy on the themes, you've got a lot of great themes that come out really well between the character interactions. Which parts of those were really important for you, and which parts evolved as you wrote the story?
Well, I think that the idea of the deep friendship between Abby and Robbie that was platonic was really important to me. And although, I mean, it was a slightly less platonic in an early draft, it sort of became evident to me like how that needed to play out. And it was important to me, I think, just to demonstrate that there is, platonic friendships between boys and girls at that age are totally normal and healthy. So that was part of it. And then I think a lot of the themes emerged as I was writing. One of them, there was, I think empathy became very important, particularly like Abby having empathy for others. And I think like, that's just something that I think in general, we need more of in our society and our culture. And I think it was also not something that you particularly see in an action adventure mystery thriller story where the main character, the protagonist, sort of wins because she has empathy for someone. And I felt like, well, that would be an interesting element to explore. So that was, it just surfaced for me. I never set out to write an issue book. I mean, it was just kind of like, I wanted to write a really exciting mystery with supernatural elements. And sometimes other people, when they're reading your work, like are much more able to discover the elements and be like, oh, did you mean to do this? And I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe.
That's brilliant, obviously.
I'm so glad you found that. I should write that down. That makes a lot of sense.
Random question: since you're working on a book 2, do you read the reviews for book 1? Does that influence how you're writing at all for book 2, or you don't bother with that?
I know you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to read the reviews. Everyone says you're not supposed to read the reviews, but I do kind of read them, and mostly I've seen enough to kind of get a sense of what people are responding to, and I wouldn't say that I've changed course with anything that I wanted to do with the sequel, but it sort of cemented like, okay, people are responding to this particular element of the story. I better make sure I don't stray too far from that. Or if I do, I need to really have a good reason for that. So, yeah.
That's a great answer. Are there any parts of the location in your story? You said a lot of them are taken from your childhood experience. Is there anywhere fun that you haven't been that you would like to go, or part of your setting that would be fun to visit?
Well, the haunted house, the house on Whispering Hill, is based on the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. It's up on a hill, and I have never actually been in it. I've seen many pictures, but more precisely, I drive by it all the time, and you can see it from the hilltop. It's now, they've turned it into condos, but as it sort of exists in my imagination, this really like incredible Gothic state hospital up on a hill. And it's very evocative. And so I think that would be a really neat location to visit. Also, just there's a scene in the book when several of the characters are in a salt marsh and they're learning a particular lesson from Miss Winters. And I just love that sort of like marshy New England fall sort of atmosphere with the smells and the crisp air and everything. And that just to me is like typical, like prototypical New England weather. And all of that and like Willow Hill and all the stuff, the surrounding areas for me are exactly where I'd like to be.
I love that. It's fun that you live around there. Okay, one thing that I find really interesting about you is you've kind of taken on this, I don't know if it's intentional, but you've kind of taken on a banner for spooky middle grade and upper middle grade, that there's not enough focus on that kind of that fine line between middle grade and teen or young adult. And so you were very clear when you brought this book to us that that's where you wanted to be, is in that upper middle grade. So can you tell us a little bit about why that's important to you, what you're hoping to accomplish with that, why you feel strongly about that in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really big gap. It's starting to fill in a little bit, but in children's literature, you know, from middle grade to young adult, the middle grade books are for characters that are ages 8 to 12, and young adult tends to be 16 to 18. And there's no bigger difference than kids that are 8 to 12 versus, you know, young adults. And the themes in those books are very, very different as well. And there's just this major gap. Like you get into reading and you're an early reader and you're reading these incredible middle grade stories, and then there's almost nothing for you. And I see in my own kids, like my son is 13, my daughter is 11, and they've kind of reached that stage where they're good readers and they've sort of outgrown or are beginning to outgrow traditional middle grade. But I don't know that they're necessarily ready for the themes that are not even ready. They're not necessarily interested in some of the themes that are coming up in young adult books. And so I think there's a gap. I think there's a need, but also I think that like ages 13, 14, 15 is just an incredible time in your life. And I mean, some of my most vivid memories, like early memories that I can still relive very clearly, are from when I was in 7th, 8th, 9th grade. Like that's when I think I started to form the personality that I have and be the person that I am. And so much of that is formative from those years. And so it was very easy for me to find within myself, like, what would I have liked at that age? What sort of stories did I want to tell, or do I want to tell that would appeal to me back then? And plus, I think kids lit, it's like the one place where there isn't really this PG-13 kind of story. I mean, you see it in the movies, you see it on Netflix. Things like Stranger Things have 13, 14, 15-year-old protagonists. And where is that in literature? Those stories are incredibly popular on TV. And I think that there is a place for it in literature as well.
I love that. How do you, going along with that, what about the spooky stories? Are you, do you feel strongly about that in general, or do you want to explore other things, or what are your feelings on that?
I mean, I love spooky stuff. Halloween is my favorite holiday. As I mentioned, I grew up in a funeral home. I would sneak out in the middle of the night and like go hang out in the cemetery with, you know, like nothing, you know, nefarious, but just like, you know, the sense of freedom to like get outside and do that. And like, and so I just always really been attracted to the spooky atmosphere. Also, I think like spooky books are so much fun because usually what makes it spooky, there's some sort of like unknown supernatural or mysterious thing, and they just invite questions. And I love questions, and I love what that, as a writer, answering those questions is, or trying to figure out what the answers to those questions are, is a lot of fun. And so I think writing a spooky story tends to allow you to explore really interesting things and do it in a way that's very, very exciting because you can create tension and mystery.
I love that. That's an excellent answer. And Stranger Things is a great example because you learn a lot about yourself as you kind of explore that tension and the scary stuff. I wanted to switch gears a bit and talk about your writing. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process and how that works for you?
So I have all kinds of really weird quirks when it comes to writing. And I used to have, I'm an editor professionally, and so I'm sort of a perfectionist. And so I used to really it was difficult for me to write fiction because I would just want it to be perfect from the beginning. And I would be editing as I was writing, and that really slows you down, but it also limits your creativity. If you're trying to get every sentence right the first time that you're writing it, you spend 2 hours writing and you look back and you've got like a paragraph, and it doesn't work that well for me. So I've adopted a sort of a faster writing approach where I will draft. I'll do the kind of like measure twice, cut once thing. So I'll spend a lot of time sitting there thinking about what I want to write, and then once I do start writing, I'll try to like really get it all down. But I've had to come up with some ways to sort of work around my perfectionism. And one of them is when I'm really drafting very roughly, I will change the font color, and I'll be like, all right, it doesn't count because it's red. So I'm just gonna word vomit onto the screen, see what comes out, and then I'll fix it. And then when I change the color to black again, that's when we'll know that like this is kind of what I had in mind. So that's one of the approaches that I have. And then the other thing is just trying to write regularly. It's hard to squeeze in a time to write when you have 2 kids and a wife and a job and commitments and everything. And so a couple of years ago, I joined the Twitter 5 a.m. Writers Club, and that means every morning I'm up. Most mornings I'm up at 5 a.m. With my coffee, and I try to carve out a couple of hours of writing. And some days that means 2,000 words, and some days it means 150 words. But it's all about sitting there and putting in the time, and just making sure that I'm moving forward and sort of living with my story every day, so that even when I'm not writing, I'm kind of working on it in my head subconsciously.
I love that. That's an excellent answer. Has that changed at all now that you've had a book published? Has that changed at all, or are you still kind of doing the same?
I think the only change is that I don't give myself as many excuses to not get up. So I'm like, well, now I've got another book I need to write, and I can't spend it. There's no excuse because people are actually waiting for this one. So I think I've become a little more, I put a little more pressure on myself to make sure that I'm working on it as often as possible. But process-wise, not so much. It is interesting because after I wrote The Witches of Willow Cove, I had the plan for what the second book would be, but I actually started a different manuscript while I was waiting to see if anyone wanted to buy Willow Cove. And that one I wrote in an entirely different way. Like I had a much different writing process for it, which was working pretty well. I was writing pretty quickly. And then when I sold this and we talked about, doing a series, I was like, all right, I'm going to go back, and now I'm going to take that idea that I had for the second book in the series, and I'm going to write it. And I sat down to write, and all of a sudden I reverted to my old writing process for Willow Cove. And I think it's because it's 2 different viewpoint characters, and it's a little more like trying to like put puzzle pieces together. It wasn't just a straight up narrative, but it did. So I'm starting to think maybe it changes from book to book or series to series, maybe depending on what kind of book it is.
That's really interesting. You'll have to let me know when you get back into that. Super interesting. I heard this question somebody else asked, and I thought it was really interesting, especially for you. I feel like you're really into marketing your book, and you do a good job just putting it out there. So I wondered, what's the best money you've ever spent as a writer? And it doesn't have to be about marketing. It could have been skill building or whatever, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think joining SCBWI, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, was a really good investment because it not only does it, let you into conferences and getting to meet industry professionals. It also was what connected me with some of my critique partners, other writers that were, also sort of working in the same genre. And that for me was a really big deal, because I resisted like critique groups for a long time, because I thought to myself, like, I only have a limited amount of time to write. When am I going to find time to read and critique other people's stuff? And would I be able to do a good job with it and put the time in? But I think writing can be a lonely enterprise. And there's nothing better than having other people that have a lot of insight sort of along the way with you and offering opinions in real time. And then also learning to critique other people's work and see things in their work that they don't see, and then communicating that back to them. And I think that teaches you to be a good writer as well, when you can kind of work on other people's stuff and identify like what is and isn't working and everything. So I think just that part of it to me has been really important and probably a great decision and a great investment.
That's an excellent answer. Very, very good. I love that. If you could tell younger Josh just starting out writing, if you could give him any advice, what would it be?
It doesn't have to be perfect on the first try. Sometimes I need to tell older Josh the same thing. I think maybe also it would be that, like, this stuff that you're writing that you really enjoy, like, other people like this kind of stuff too. So that's a big question when you're writing, is like, does anyone else like this stuff? Am I writing something that people are going to enjoy? And I think it would be a big relief to younger me to know that, yes, people are going to enjoy this kind of stuff and there is an audience for it. And just keep having fun with it, because when you have fun with it, I think it shows in the writing and in the story.
Definitely. Yeah. On that note, hopefully, I know a lot of people who are on tonight have already read the book. For those who haven't, what are you excited for people to discover? What are you most pumped about your book?
I think I really like the fact that people tend to read it quickly, because it's I really set it up as a story. It kind of came together as a story that's kind of a page turner, that every chapter sort of makes you want to jump into the next one and see what's going to happen next. I love that, like, what happens next sort of element to it. But I'm also excited for people to discover the friendships and the different characters. And I love hearing from different people who have different favorite characters. It's like characters, sometimes they're just minor characters, or they're, sort of characters that walked into the manuscript and demanded to have a larger role. But as I said earlier, they're all like little pieces of me in some way. And when someone says like, oh, I really like Piper, or Amethyst is my favorite, or I really identify with Zeus, that makes me feel good. And I'm really excited for people to meet those characters and come away with some sort of personal connection with them.
I love that. Totally off script, but what is the best thing that has happened so far? I know you tweeted the other day about a kid emailing you that it was their favorite book. It was incredible.
Like, we did I've been doing a lot of like virtual classroom visits with some other authors. And I'm just always amazed when people have read my book and responded to it. And just to see people responding to it and saying like, or asking, what's going to happen next? What's going on in the sequel? It's just exciting that people care, and I think that's been the biggest thing, is just writing. I would write even if no one else read, because these are stories that I want to tell. But it is gratifying that people are reading it and discovering it and wanting to know what happens next.
Awesome. And I know you're in the process of drafting and things are still coming together for book 2, but are there any teasers or exciting things that you want to share to expect in book 2?
Well, let's see. So I'll try not to give away any spoilers for the people who haven't read the first book either, but the next book opens on Abby's 14th birthday. So it's Halloween, about 8 months after the end of the first book. She's 14. There are a lot of things teased at the end of the first book, so we get to finally meet the Council of Witches. Tina is now their teacher, so good to see like what it's like when you have these girls that have been witches for about a year now, and they're feeling pretty good about their powers, and they have a good teacher, and everything seems to be going well. So obviously something's going to come along and take them down a notch. And I think, the first book was, there was a lot of exploring about, the villain of the first book isn't exactly a villain. She has her own story, her own motivations, and I wanted to see what would happen if they face someone that really doesn't have that good side. What happens if they face something that really is just bad and wants and has some plans for them. And so I think the second book is about making the world a little bit bigger, and introducing us, taking us maybe outside of Willow Cove a little bit, seeing what witchcraft looks like in some other places, and doing some terrible things to some of my favorite characters, unfortunately.
You're a terrible person, John. That's awesome. Okay, I have a little shotgun round because I like to know what authors are like outside of their books. But so if you have any final questions, send those in the comments now, because we'll do this shotgun round and then we'll kind of wrap up. So Josh, I know that as an author and a reader, it's hard to pick a favorite author. Do you have an all-time favorite and a current favorite?
I have so many different favorites. What I tend to find an author, and then I'm always delighted when I discover that there's actually like, this person's been writing for a while and now they have 6 books, and I'll just like read all 6 books. But so I grab some props. Here are my current favorites. Emily St. John Mandel, Station 11, Kate Morton, Kate Atkinson, and Tana French. These are my current favorite novelists.
All good ones. Good. And your current favorite book?
Other than this one?
No, that's all you need, right?
Well, actually, right now, I was just talking about this earlier with someone. It definitely changes all the time. But I will say my all-time favorite book is Lord of the Rings.
You're in good company with Darby and Hannah and a lot of Lord of the Rings fans in here. Favorite music?
I like, I'm so like just clinically uncool. I like, I like movie soundtracks. I think it's because I listen to music all day while I'm writing and editing. And I think now that we are all working from home, my wife and I are working from home, and both my kids are doing school remotely from home, I think everyone in the house is entirely sick of me listening to like the Lord of the Rings soundtrack. But it's kind of like that, and Hamilton and a few others are just kind of on repeat.
That's awesome.
But I could just see like, that someone will walk by my room and like the stirring music will like, reach a crescendo, and then it'll just be like an eye roll that'll just keep going.
Oh, that's funny. Clinically uncool is my new favorite phrase. That's super funny. Okay, favorite television show?
Right now, well, so my current favorite television show, we just binge watched Cobra Kai seasons 1 and 2, which is so good. It's like so cheesy, but so good. I also really like The Mandalorian recently. We're watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is good. And then Stranger Things is probably my favorite of the past several years.
Awesome. Great answers. Favorite snack?
Ice cream. Every night, it's like this Pavlovian response. We sit down to watch television. I'm like, oh, I need a bowl of ice cream.
It's okay right now, right? With everything.
Yeah, it is. We all deserve ice cream right now.
I agree. Those are good answers. Darby asks, I think this is a really interesting question. Are you going to include any mention of the pandemic in book 2?
So it's interesting because the way I did the calendar, when I wrote the first book, I was like, okay, Halloween is on this night because it makes sense for my story. And then it lined up that was actually 2019. So I built the story around the calendar for 2019. And then I started doing the second book, and I was like, all right, well then, Halloween is, now we're in 2020. Obviously, the pandemic changed things. So the book is not actually set in 2020, it just sort of mirrors it. But I actually just wrote a scene recently where a character makes reference to an unspecific pandemic in the past that they may have experienced. So I'm not working it into the story, but I would say it's a world where their pandemic happened, but somehow happened a while ago, maybe when they were a little bit younger.
That's perfect. I love that. Well, we wanted to do a giveaway. We have one of our other spooky reads. I don't have it in front of me. These Wicked Waters. Sorry, it's Mermaid, Siren, spooky story. So we have a little Mermaid spooky story prize pack for those of you who participated in the book club. So we drew names, and Carrie is going to draw a name, and she said the winner is Mariah. So congratulations. Thank you so much for participating. And we'd still love to hear your thoughts on the questions over the next few days as you come to the page. So any final thoughts, Josh? Any last words or?
My last words are, well, I'm glad. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for doing this. And thank you especially to everyone who has read the book and has enjoyed it. I'm really glad. I'm really flattered that people are interested in the book and cared enough to watch this. So thank you.
Yeah, you've done an amazing job, Josh. I love reading all of the reviews, and just people are so excited about it. And it's just a fast, fun, exciting read. And you've really nailed so many awesome things about a good book. So I'm super proud of you for it. And thank you for talking with us. It's always fun to learn more about you and the world you live in and the weird way your mind works. So thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we appreciate you being here and hope you have a good night.
Bye everyone.
Subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss an upload. Or join us live every Thursday for author interviews, book clubs, writing advice, and more on Facebook at Owl Hollow Press, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. See you Thursday.